So there's a couple different ways that you can go about gathering organic shapes. In your lecture, I talk about looking at Ernst Haeckel's botanical illustrations. You're welcome. You could trace off of a computer if you wanted to, a computer screen, as long as you're careful. And then you can also find things off the internet and print them off and trace them that way. Right now I've got a book that I'm looking at, but I could have easily downloaded this from a library database of, flowers or things that I like. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some tracing paper. I'm using tracing paper for the demo just so that you can see it really well, but copy paper would work just as well. I'm going to take my fairly soft pencil, and I'm not going to trace all of this, but I am going to give you an idea of kind of the process for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to go through and I'm going to start tracing the different shapes that I see. You want to be thinking about that these are elements that you will then be cutting out of paper. So if you go too detailed with this might be a little bit too intricate and a little bit too tricky to work with. But what I'm doing is I'm just getting the basic ideas. And keep in mind, we can abstract this, we can play with this. This is really kind of looking at the shape rather than kind of like what is the actual and specific element. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to go through and kind of trace everything, get that laid out. And then the next step is going to be transferring this tracing onto a piece of black paper. So what I'm going to do, and I've already got an element set up for you guys. This is a tracing that I've already done. So in order for this to work though, in order for me to transfer it over to the black paper, one of the things I'm going to have to be doing is being able to transfer it. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, I've got it on one side, and you'll notice over here on this one, if I flip it over, you can't see it as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I can be able to see it on both sides because I'm going to do a graphite transfer. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just simply going to trace it on the other side. So I've got one side that I've traced. And a softer pencil is going to allow that transfer to happen a little bit more smoothly. So I'm making my line just a little bit thicker just so that I can really see it. And so let's say that I had a full drawing on this side, same as this one. I would go through and I would trace the entire thing. So I have my initial tracing on this side, which I was starting to do. And then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to trace it again on the back side. Now to transfer over, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my black piece of paper, and this is where you can make kind of a creative decision. Either you can keep it the same way that you had it when you drew it and traced it, or you can mirror it. So I could flip it either way. Either way I can make a transfer this way. So in this piece I've got it traced out, and then also on this side I have it traced out as well, so that when I go back through, I'm going to actually invert it this time. Which will look a little bit different than my demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to go through and I'm pressing fairly hard just so that I can make that transfer. So what's happening is the graphite is being transferred onto the other side. If you feel comfortable kind of freehanding, if you feel like you can look at that botanical illustration and draw it directly onto the black paper, you are certainly welcome to do so. Make sure that it's a faithful reproduction. I think what's really important is that you start to see shape in a different way. So if you are making a lot of changes to what the shapes look like, that's not quite what we're doing in this project. So I'm basically just pressing down on the back with my pencil, and I'm transferring it. And once I get this complete, I'll flip it over and show you what this will look like. This also gives you a good sense of kind of like how large of a shape you should be working with. It gives you a sense of kind of like what is that positive and negative going to look like? How am I going to approach this project? So I'm going to finish up down here. I'll go back through here. And I'm rushing a little bit just for the sake of time, but you guys should be a little bit more precise than this. But I just want to be able to show you guys what this will look like. All right, so, and then when I lift it up, You can see that now I've got my graphite transferred, and now I have a ballpark idea of where to cut and how to cut. When you're cutting out your shapes, especially your organic shapes, always, always, always be aware of safety, be aware of your other hand. And then also think about what is the best way to approach cutting out what we're working with. So for me right now, what I'm thinking about is I kind of want to go ahead and jump in with my scissors. So a lot of times I go back and forth between my scissors and my X-Acto blade. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself a cut just to get started. And if you want a true inverse of what you're working with, one thing that you should keep in mind is you probably will be using your X-Acto blade a little bit more. You'll notice I'm turning the paper according to kind of what makes sense. And then I've got some smaller detail areas in here. So what I might end up doing is switching over to my X-Acto blade, always being conscious of what's happening with my left hand. And I'm going to go in and maybe manipulate and work with some smaller, more detailed areas. When you're working with your X-Acto blade, you always want to be turning the paper. You don't ever want to be static. You notice I'm being really careful as I'm going through and cutting this little tiny detail right here. I'm anchoring it with my left hand. And I'm going very slow and steady. You don't want to be pushing so hard that it feels like the blade is going to jump. That's when it can get dangerous and kind of hurt you. But you also don't want to be rushing this. Like this, once again, is kind of a very zen thing. Also, if you feel like any of your graphite lines are not showing up very well, you can go back in with a pencil and just simply draw them back in. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to kind of cut in all these little details, being careful, going slow, moving my paper as I need to move it. I don't want to rush this. And then also being careful on kind of these big long stripes. You don't want to, big long areas, you don't want to kind of rush or go through that. And then I might stop and say, is it better to go back to my scissors? Is it, so it's kind of a personal decision in terms of what elements are easier or more difficult to work with. You always want to be thinking about like, where is my hand in relation to my other hand? So as I'm continuing to cut this out, you can start to see it starting to form here. And when I'm totally finished, I will have a negative area like we talked about. And then I'll also have my positive area. When we're working with our compositions, it might be that you're kind of looking at that and you're like, oh, well, what if I take this and I kind of trace it and I take more negative elements out of it? So there's a lot of kind of play that can happen. You can also overlap. You'll notice some interesting things happen with that. You'll notice that this is kind of a really big square heavy area. It might be that you want to kind of trace some other organic shapes that kind of fit in there and kind of start to play with what does that edge look like. The other thing that you guys will be working with is rectilinear pieces. And so what I'm going to do is we'll just So when you're working with rectilinear pieces, you want to be thinking about, is it rounded? And I will go ahead and forewarn you guys that cutting a perfect circle is incredibly difficult, even if you have scissors. So do keep in mind, if you do a composition with a lot of circles, that's going to be a little bit tricky to work with. So I know that I'm working with a composition that has rectilinear elements to it, so I'm going to be using my ruler. So let's see. And once again, I'm going to anchor my ruler with my left hand, and then I'm going to be working with just dragging it very gently, very carefully. Your blade should be really super sharp. And now I have some rectilinear elements to work with. What's great about all these shapes is you can then cut out shapes in between those shapes or out of those shapes. There's lots of different ways to kind of play with it. Might be you have a bunch of kind of rectilinear shapes and then you cut some curvilinear shapes out of it. The scale of your shapes you can change. You'll notice I'm going to start cutting some smaller pieces. And you can cut teeny tiny pieces if you want to. Some students, like, they really, really enjoy this project. So you can start to play with kind of scale. What is the relationship between these two sides? And then the other thing that you can also do is you can cut out rectilinear shapes within. So remember we're talking about, and these I would go ahead and trace. I'm going to just kind of freehand it. But these are things that you can kind of go in, create some rectilinear shapes, and then play with what's positive and negative. So here, if I move this out of the way, you can start to play with some things like this. Like maybe you have a bunch of triangles cut out of that. Maybe you have triangles cut out of there. There's so many different ways to kind of approach the assignment and different ways to work with it.